What you're hearing from Tim and Andy and Greg eventually is the reality that it's been so transforming and what an incredible blessing it's been for the people that are involved, because ministry is unique. I keep saying that over and over again, and Andy says that and others. Ministry is unique. Do not miss that. You may work a full-time job, but that job is nothing like the uniqueness of your ministry. And for minister and spouse, it is unique. There is no other profession that matches its importance, its danger, or its uniqueness. Politics comes close, but politics does not have the eternal weight. From the lack of margin to the administrative and financial burden to being burned, spiked, and bitten by well-intentioned dragons, preyed on by devils, on call 24/7, to carrying the weight of eternity on our shoulders, ministry is unique and dangerous. I want you to listen to this quote from Samuel Chan. Please just take a moment and walk through this for a second as we move through. The minister's pain is pervasive and persistent. Pastors see more of the underbelly of life than members of any other profession. Insurance agents see those who come to them for protection against physical and financial loss. Bankers and mortgage brokers see people who have financial need. Doctors treat physical problems. Mechanics look under the car hood. None of them see people at the bottom and top of their lives at all times. From the greatest celebrations like wedding and birth to the times of deepest loss like divorce, disease, and death, pastors are exposed to the highest hopes and the deepest depths of those in their care. And it's not temporary. It's from the womb to the tomb, every week, day in and day out. And on top of all of these previously mentioned intrinsic dangers of ministry, ministers are the unsung first responders in every community. Let me let that sink in. You are the unsung first responders in any community. Ministers are the unsung first responders in that ministers are the first to be called when someone dies, when there's a physical disaster like a fire or an accident, when there's an emotional trauma like an affair discovered or an unwanted pregnancy or a terminal diagnosis is given, when someone is arrested, when someone loses their job, when a child is found out to be addicted to drugs. They're calling you. You're right in the mix. Now, albeit this is the minister as a first responder, this reality is real, the minister is not at all like first responders. The minister is not at all like a fireman. The minister is not at all like a policeman or an EMT. Every single call that a pastor receives is personal. It's personal. I asked several first responders that I know in my congregation and on my soccer team how they handle the stress of traumatic situations that they are constantly called to. And every one of them responded this way. They said that because we have no personal relationship with the victim, there is an emotional insulation from the personalization of the trauma effect. Not so with the pastor. Every call is personal. Now, deepening the impact of trauma for the first responding pastor is the personal relationship that continues after the acute trauma. What police officer, after being called to the scene of a suicide, expects to find a person that they deeply care about, and then have to comfort the family that has suffered that suicide throughout the process of grieving? What policeman do you know that goes to a suicide call has to end up doing the funeral of the person who committed suicide? And then officiate that funeral, of course, and then to follow up with the family for months and months with prayer and counsel. No regular first responder experiences the depth of personal loss and responsibility that the pastor does. As a minister, time and time again, you are called to these things. So in spite of the noble career of influencing all in eternity, you are neck deep in warfare. For instance, as a pastor or a minister, have you ever been ambushed by a person in your church? I'm not talking about first responder. That's an entirely other dimension of your world. You go to suicide, you go to death, you go to the hospital, you get involved in crisis of relationship and affairs. But then now let's bring it home to that which is personal. As a minister, have you ever had or been ambushed by a person in church? You ever been betrayed by someone in your church whom you thought was faithful to you? Have you been undermined by someone in your church? Have you had someone in your church threaten the health and well-being of you and or your family? Have you had your financial security threatened? Had your integrity called into question? As a result of this trauma, have you found yourself isolating or avoiding relational connections in the church? Have you been hypervigilant about protecting yourself or family from further trauma? This is the shrinking into yourself, protecting, going back into your shell that Tim talked about, into that cocoon. Have you found it hard to sleep because you're thinking about church turmoil? Had trouble concentrating because of traumatic church experiences? Experienced spikes of fear or anxiety when you see a certain person in a store or they appear on your caller ID? I will never forget having a panic attack just turning down the frozen food section of the grocery store and seeing a person that was in conflict in the church. I went to the fresh food section immediately. Do you often dread Sundays for fear of being attacked or hurt? Do you feel depressed or spent? Are you generally exhausted from never being able to turn ministry off? This is the kind of warfare type experience, attacks from within, meaning church members and church friends, church staff perhaps, other pastors. Attacks from without, such as societal missiles of immorality, social media bombings of the ego, secularization, pluralization, the terrorism of technology that attempts to undermine your soul and the satisfaction of ministry. Ministry is dangerous for the minister and their family. What did Chan say? Pain in ministry is pervasive and persistent. Were you fully prepared by CAMS for this? Were you fully prepared by MIP or getting a degree from Lee University or going to Catalyst conferences or reading Outreach magazine articles? Were you fully prepared for the extensiveness of unique dangers in ministry? Often I've heard ministers describe being dropped into their church context like a soldier being dropped into the jungles of Vietnam. But the minister has no training. The minister drops into the church context and expects for everybody to be friendly and for everybody to be happy that they're there. My first assignment out of Lee University was to show up at a church in Phoenix, Arizona. And me and LaDon were treated and encountered so coldly, so distant. It was a year and a half later when the pastor resigned one Sunday morning and just walked out that later on we found out from council members that they had never been told we were coming. In fact, 6 months earlier, they had fired the previous youth pastor because the church couldn't afford a youth pastor. We showed up and were announced on that Sunday thinking we were going to be received with open arms and thrill. But the people felt betrayed by the pastor. And we were the object of betrayal. Sometimes it feels like you're dropped into a context and you think you know what you're going into. And you realize this is a hostile environment. The minister has no training. We have no equipment or anticipation for the guerrilla warfare that often comes with ministry territory. I recently heard a story about a minister who used to serve in our area, our region. He went to the doctor for chronic fatigue. And when the doctor reviewed his blood work, the doctor said to him, when did you get back from the theater? And he said, I ain't seen no movies recently. And the doctor said, oh, no, I meant war. I mean, your blood work and the levels of your hormones are exactly like that I've seen in people in war zones that have come back from military operations. Ministry can be warlike. If you've experienced several of these symptoms, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and I'm speaking to you as a psychotherapist, according to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, you qualify for a clinical diagnosis of PTSD. If you've experienced any of these kinds of symptoms, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them in any way or anything like them, you actually clinically qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. But in our world of ministry, I'm coining a slightly different but equally valid diagnosis. If you've experienced several of these traumas and symptoms, then you're suffering from PTSD. Post-traumatic stress pastoring. In my professional ministry and counseling experience, I know that the best practice for addressing this diagnosis, this condition, is a combination of soul health practices that are both individual and group oriented. One or the other is not nearly as robust as both. You may think, well, I've got my little gig going. I do my little devotional and I do my little podcast and I got my thing going. That's nice. But without group interaction and group accountability and group support, you are vulnerable for increasing symptomology of PTSD. This is why we're here today. This is why you are in danger. Because of the uniqueness of ministry, whether a children's pastor, a youth pastor, a lay pastor, a lead pastor, a pastor's spouse, a pastor's husband, a pastor's wife, you are in danger. Do not minimize the reality of the position and the career that you hold. This is why David's doing what David's doing. This is why the bishop's doing what the bishop's doing. This is why I created Ministry Oasis. This is simply an opportunity for you to access quality resources that are going to be able to help you engage healthy practices. Speaking of engage, if you'll go to the Church of God website, scroll down just a little bit, you will see Engage Leadership Journal that the Church of God publishes periodically. It is a professional clergy journal. In that particular journal this month, it just came out yesterday, there is an article that I've written that also provides this material at length and then also linkage to other resources that are available for you. And this is why I'm advocating these clergy covenant groups. Because as Andy said, as Tim said, as David and I have attempted to communicate, we are in danger and we need each other.